Today let's talk about something important: postmodernism and the current state of Western culture. In this hyper-connected world, we are inundated with new ideas around our history and our identity, which is often very confusing. I want to preface this by saying I think there's so much to be grateful for. Compared to any other time in history, objectively speaking, we live in a time of abundance and freedom. And yet, people are divided. Heightened polarization, the large gap between the left and the right, people searching for something to grasp onto, an ideology, a faith. There's so much to unpack. Plenty of confusion, blame, guilt, anger, frustration, resentment. Many of us don't know where to stand. What's the best way forward? Well, first things first, let's take a massive step back and look at the context. Where have we come from? How did we get here? And where should we go? When looking at the development of the West, it is vital to understand the key philosophical frameworks that underlie and influence society. I suppose this can best be categorized as pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. And this will act as our guide in which to examine how people view the world and the subsequent influence in culture. First, we have the pre-modern time period, which dominated the West for around 1,000 years. During this period, operating with a medieval worldview made up of feudalism and faith, people understood reality through the lens of the supernatural, found in the Bible. This was the cultural philosophy of the time. To put it succinctly, everything was seen through the frame of religion. Roman Catholicism largely dictated the terms of engagement. The artwork fixated on accuracy, beauty, and honouring religious values. In essence, the message sent to people was to not question authority, whether from the church or the monarch, and to live with faith. We often focus on the kings and queens of the time, and therefore have a rosy retrospection of the day-to-day lifestyle. But the truth is, peasants made up nearly 90% of the population, working on the land with virtually no rights, a limited diet, little comfort, no education, no medication. The Black Death practically wiped out half of the European population. This was the cultural context, the day-to-day reality. Then there is a period of transition as we move into modernity, Reformation, Renaissance, and the Enlightenment. There is a shift in philosophy led by English philosophers Francis Bacon and John Locke, as well as French philosopher René Descartes, who, although differed in their approach, all fundamentally agreed that intellectual reason was the way forward, that we didn't have to rely solely on mysticism and the supernatural, but that we could use our own natural intelligence in order to discover objective truth and knowledge. These men ushered in a new wave of thinking that promoted science and individualism. With this seismic philosophical shift, an Enlightenment vision was underway. Having explored individualism, John Locke led the way promoting liberalism, with life, liberty, and property as basic rights. Later we had Adam Smith, seen by many as the father of capitalism. His book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, marks a clear paradigm shift in the field of economics, shaping government policy soon after it was published. Fundamentally, Smith's model inspires the entrepreneurial spirit of the individual to innovate and adapt to the needs of a free market. In addition, on the scientific front, we made leaps forward in engineering and medicine, with the invention of the steam engine in the 1700s and the invention of the smallpox vaccine in 1796. And this progress continued. Under modern rationality, we made huge leaps forward in all areas of life: planes, trains, automobiles, technology, medication, rights, freedoms, and access. But not so fast. In the name of modern rationality, there was also plenty of catastrophe. After all, Nietzsche famously proclaimed, "God is dead," the metaphorical idea that with Enlightenment philosophy and science, we had killed the foundational necessity for the previous religious substructure and a belief in God. And in its wake, new ideologies would emerge, and with that, plenty to critique. Nothing is ever simple, and there's much to be skeptical of. Pure logic and reason may not be as easy to define. Many philosophers, such as Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, all collectively contributed with various different philosophies, questioning modernism's emphasis on reason, progress, and objective truth.
Reason cuts up and makes categories and makes encyclopedias and defines things and creates borders. And so scientific type thinking identified ethnic boundaries and said, these are the Turks, these are the Greeks, these are the Jews, these are the Germans, these are all these races. So you can see where that leads, right? It leads into certain directions, and part of which are World War I, World War II. If you have things that are too solid, they're weapons. If you have things that are too closed and too hermetic and too tight, then they become bludgeons to hit against the things that aren't that around it in the human sphere.
This all lays the foundation for a new way of thinking to emerge. Skepticism taken to its furthest extreme, the next philosophical framework, modernism to postmodernism. Headed by French thinkers such as Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jean-François Lyotard, and American Richard Rorty. Postmodernism has been defined in many ways by many people, but in this scenario, we are referring to an intellectual framework that rejects the modernist project of objective truth and scientific rationality in favor of subjectivity, relativity, and social constructionism. Paraphrasing Lyotard, simplifying to the extreme, postmodernism is incredulity towards meta-narratives. Derrida primarily focused on literary theory, linguistics, and how language shapes our understanding of reality with his deconstructionism. Derrida suggests that all texts are inherently unstable, that words and meanings can always be deferred to other words and meanings, and thus never fully fixed, emphasizing that no single word or concept is self-sufficient. Foucault theorized the interrelation of power and knowledge, that power relations are embedded within what counts as knowledge, that what we accept as knowledge is actually influenced by power structures, and equally, that knowledge can then be used to enforce and reinforce power. On the face of it, given humankind's ability to become corrupted and to wield science and reason not for the greater good, but for nefarious purposes of power and control, examples such as eugenics or the history of terrible psychiatric practices. You could look at this philosophy as a way of ushering in a radical skepticism towards authority, control, and introducing a complete tolerance of all ways of life, acting as a sort of perfect intellectual framework for empathetic people to diplomatically use to avoid conflict in everyday life. But that's not where they stop. Whether intended or unintended, they also usher in a new narrative. Given their far left, predominantly Marxist backgrounds, previously viewing the world in terms of the oppressed proletariat and the oppressor bourgeoisie, it makes perfect sense for them to then view the world of knowledge and reason in these same terms. That fundamentally, all knowledge is simply a power battle between the different social classes, and that all history, science, and Western philosophy should then be deconstructed to reveal the baked-in oppressor dynamics that make up the world. That last part is where the problems arise. What could be charitably seen as a diplomatic tolerance of all ideas just turned into a political philosophy that is inherently cynical, distrustful, and divisive.
A lot of the stuff that's happening now is basically is weaponizing postmodernism simply to undo the current order.
Now let's set the stage. It is very clear postmodern philosophy has sunk into Western culture. Here is postmodern professor Thaddeus Russell stating as much.
The central argument that was made by Foucault and postmodernists was that none of these things are biologically determined, that there is no natural essence to anything, that everything is a social construct. We looked at history and we saw, first of all, that all these categories have changed over time, which tells us that they're just inventions. They're just inventions that get reinvented all the time, okay? And second of all, they have served the purposes of ruling elites because they get to put people in their boxes and control them more easily. None of this is biological. None of this is inevitable. You are now free to do what you want as an individual. It was a liberating moment. It has become the dominant way of thinking in academia. And I have to say, in my view, it is the supreme achievement of academics ever.
That's it?
That's it. But it's huge.
Thaddeus even recognized, Michel Foucault has been cited in 1.3 million academic publications, more than twice as many as Marx and 6 times as many as Darwin. It is difficult to find a humanities scholar who doesn't borrow from Foucault's work. Postmodernism's influence cannot be understated, and with this influence, we have a whole wave of new political movements and frameworks: postmodern feminism, post-colonialism, critical race theory, and intersectionality. A string of new postmodern public intellectuals have made their way into the mainstream. People such as Judith Butler, with her famous book Gender Trouble, which challenges the traditional binary understanding of gender.
We are rattling to the core heteronormative family structures. We are rattling them to the core. What they have to lose is the belief in their supremacy, their immutability, their necessity, their universality, and that is a big loss for them. But they're going to have to grieve that loss. And that's what we're telling them. Grieve that loss and enter into a better world with the rest of us.
Bell hooked with her essay, Postmodern Blackness, introducing us to the idea of a
imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy.
Kimberly Crenshaw, who attempts to fuse postmodern theory with contemporary politics, with her idea of
intersectionality, to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice.
And lastly, Robin DiAngelo, with her idea of white fragility, that white people are socialized into a system of white supremacy from a very early age.
Where all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, I'm white.
Yep.
And I felt so loudly white that I remember being hesitant to go outside. I didn't want to go outside because everybody could see that I was white.
Ultimately, downstream, what does this give us? What is the philosophical end goal here?
I live in a fantasy world where I believe the patriarchy will be toppled any minute now.
Cool. Okay.
Well, if you have a postmodern foundation and believe that everything is a social construct, and that this society is a so-called cis-heteronormative patriarchy predicated on an oppressive power structure, then the solution would be to abolish this patriarchy, dismantle this oppressive structure, and to create an egalitarian utopia. But what if this framework is wrong? That it is missing something? That it is incomplete? There is no denying there is still racism and misogyny, and plenty of asymmetries in many careers and fields of study. But what if it wasn't so systemic, so tyrannical, so absolute? What if the patriarchy, to use Judith Butler's word, is itself a phantasm of postmodernism, a conspiracy, an idea developed from the foundations of an overly critical, overly skeptical philosophical framework, an incorrect ideology, too simplistic, too one-dimensional, aimed to divide us? Given the rise in this way of thinking, there's also been plenty of pushback, starting with the topic of race, best encapsulated by Morgan Freeman in this interview.
I don't want a Black History Month. Black history is American history.
How are we going to get rid of racism until...
Stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man. I know you as Mike Wallace, you know me as Morgan Freeman.
Additionally, Coleman Hughes, an independent political writer, just released his new book, The End of Race Politics: Arguments for a Colorblind America. A clip of him went viral on The View, which summarizes the core political debate.
The reason I wrote this book is because in the past 10 years, it has become very popular to, in the name of anti-racism, teach a kind of philosophy to our children and in general that says your race is everything, right? And I think that is the wrong way to fight racism, and that's why I wrote this book at this time.
In terms of sexuality, we have people like Douglas Murray, an openly gay author and political commentator who even pushes back against the idea of a queer community, given that it doesn't encapsulate the wide variety of beliefs and attitudes within this perceived community.
But I also am worried by, and have been worried for a long time, by the extraordinary intolerance of elements of the so-called gay community, which I say so-called because there is no such thing. when people say the gay community, who are you talking about? It's like women think this. Oh, really? 50% of the species all agree on something. And it's the same with this. Why would we be falling for this interpretation of society as depending solely or primarily on interest groups based on gender/sex, sexual orientation, race, and a bit more? Why would we be taking the individualism out of individuals and lumping them in these demonstrably incoherent bodies that don't even exist? They don't even exist. The LGBT community, take me to your leader.
We also have Camille Paglia, the famous American academic, social critic, and self-described street-smart feminist, an ardent critic of postmodern feminism.
Foucault is simply this a mechanism. It's like a little tiny kit by which they can approach everything in culture, but the contortions of language, the deliberate, labyrinthine, elitist language, at the same time as pretending to be a leftist. Okay, this is one of the biggest frauds ever practiced. To use the word patriarchy in a slapdash way, so amateurist, absolutely, it just shows people know nothing about history, whatever, have done no reading.
And of course, in terms of male patriarchy, Professor Jordan Peterson, perhaps the most famous public intellectual, pushing back against this potentially harmful and destructive ideology.
What about looking back over history? You've written the idea that women were oppressed throughout history is an appalling theory. They haven't had a great time though, have they?
Who has had a great time in history?
But men have had less of a
Really, have
time.
they? Have they? By what standard? By what standard?
But it took longer for women to get the vote, and women belong to their husbands, and in this country, one woman dies every week from domestic violence, a man dies like once a month, I believe, from that same cause. Like, aren't there some clearly obvious things that...
There are inequalities in the catastrophes that the genders are subject to. And so, look, first of all, there's some things we got to get straight. In 1895, the typical Westerner lived on less than $1 a day, which is absolute poverty by today's standards, right? And so people were brutally poor for almost the entire course of human history. It was rough. You say, well, did men or women have it worse? It's like, well, most of the time men and women helped each other. Like women raised their sons, husbands protected their families. I'm not buying this whole, the sexes have been at each other's throats the entire history of mankind.
So, bringing this video full circle, what is the solution, the way forward? Seeing the impact of postmodernism and the ideological implications that follows, I hope we can now see there is something fundamentally wrong and harmful in this worldview. And the solution is to find a sort of humility in your beliefs, being willing to learn from the past and from others, seeing the values of modernism and where it has got us. Of course, there is still corruption, abuse of power, and oppression, which should, of course, be challenged. But that is not the whole picture. We don't live in an oppressive patriarchy, but actually a free and liberal Western society, and that with rationality, individualism, freedom, and responsibility, we can come together, not wanting to attack and destroy the fundamentals of culture, but wanting to rejuvenate and reintegrate the lessons of the past, focus our energy towards the problems of today together with science on our side as we work towards a better future.